welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, joined as always by Dr. Benway, and we're going to be talking about the film director Bernardo Bertolucci, who recently died. And he had a long and distinguished career that culminated, of course, with The Last Emperor, which won for him the Academy Award for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay. I also believe that it won Best Picture, but I don't know if he was a producer on it. That's not important. He was quite the figure in film. He had a lot of controversial pictures in his day. And Benway, what do you think of him?
Well, I wanted to have this episode because a few weeks ago, 3 important artists died within days of each other. 3 important artists, at least for me. Bertolucci's one. You already kind of highlighted some of the big things for him. Nicholas Roeg, an English filmmaker who, amongst other things, did the Man Who Fell to Earth, Don't Look Now. But for me, as a little kid, the movie he directed that meant a lot to me was The Witches, the movie with Angelica Houston. It was like one of the late stages of his career. And Ricky Jay, who was a magician, sleight of hand artist, conman, or at least a historian of conmen, and writer of very purplish.
He was never a con man. No.
Writer of very purplish prose. And and what it is, they were 3 very imaginative, surrealist. Well, surrealist is the wrong word. They were not neo-realist filmmakers. They were not people who were like, I'm going to show you about the nitty gritty, kitchen sink shit, and that's all. There was an exuberance about all 3 of them.
Yeah.
All 3 of them really either were lush in their visuals, or in their choice of editing and montage, or in their language, in the case of Ricky Jay. And Bertolucci probably was the most important because for me, when I was young, I was born in 1986, The Last Emperor came out in 87, which for those of you who would have cable at the time, like the years preceding that, those next 3 years, was a movie that was always on cable. And as a young kid, to me, this was the first manifestation of a depiction of something new and exotic. For those of you who don't know, The Last Emperor, the first hour or so of that film takes place in the Forbidden City in China, with the height of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu regalia of the time. And as a young kid, that is something exotic, new, exciting to experience. And as I grew older, I appreciated more and more what he did. And for our crowd, what's interesting about him, he was a very politically minded filmmaker, undoubtedly a communist. And there's no question about that's where his mind and sentiments lay. But at the same time, a communist who was not afraid to point out when his own side was full of shit. A communist who, like many Italian communists, had sympathies galore for an aristocratic and agrarian style of life, which, as any good communist would know, is kind of anathema to certain communists. But also someone who had an obsession with fascist politics in a way that wasn't entirely just, fascist meanies. And someone who's also obsessed with sex. And how that psychologically overlaps with politics. I think the best summary of Bertolucci you could get in like a single phrase was when Paul Schrader, the filmmaker Paul Schrader, said Bertolucci is basically a man who took Freud and Marx, threw them into a bed together, held a gun to their head, and said "fuck."
Yeah, I revisited some of his pictures that I hadn't seen, I realized, in close to 30 years, if not more than 30 years, actually. And I as a grown man now, watching his films, I found them full of shit, to tell you the truth. I was very disappointed. It was an unpleasant experience for me, especially The Conformist, which I had such fond memories of. And I realized that they were fond memories visually. Thematically, and as a grown man now with a lot more mileage, it was a disappointing experience. And I have to say that this podcast for me has been how can I put this? You see, a lot of the films that I watched when I was a teenager, a late teenager, early 20s, when I didn't really know what the hell I was thinking about or what I believed in. I didn't know shit from Shinola because I was a child, literally, in some cases. And so I saw a lot of pictures back in the day, and I have fond memories of them. And then because of the podcast, because we've been going over some of these films, and as I go over them and look at them again, I see them with a lot more experience than I did when I saw them back in the day. And because of that, my appreciation of the pictures is severely decreases. We had a conversation about this about Network. Back in the day, I thought it was all right, and now I didn't. And the same thing happened to me. I tried to slog my way through Novecento, which is which is Bertolucci's opus magnus before he did Last Emperor, and I found it a slog. I thought to myself that what am I looking at? I'm not looking at a finished picture. I'm looking at a rough cut. This guy didn't finish this picture. The Conformist, I thought it was kind of incoherent. And it was sort of like hysterical about fascism without even knowing what the hell fascism is. I was I have to admit that he dropped in my estimation by quite a bit, and my estimation of Vittorio Storaro rose as I watched these pictures again. Because what happened, I realized that so much of Bertolucci depended on Storaro. And so much of what I had appreciated back in the day was really Storaro, not the direction. And the direction, I found it like I said, intellectually incoherent. And also I was surprised at how sloppily edited the pictures were in general. And it was just rather shocking. That was a part that I found really kind of surprising. There were elements of it that I was extremely impressed by. Looking at Last Tango in Paris, which I rewatched, I was even more impressed by Marlon Brando's performance. That picture is owned by Marlon Brando in a way that The Godfather is not, which was made in the same year. But I want to talk about all this. But the underlying thing that I want to get down is that I think that his politics made his work less meritorious. It sort of like diminished his work, and his politics. I mean, get woke, go broke kind of thing. Yeah, that's what I felt in his pictures, looking at them and contrasting them with his peers, such as Roman Polanski, such as Milos Forman, who were equally political. Well, I don't know if you could say that Roman Polanski is that political.
Polanski was not political.
Yeah, but Milos Forman was politically aware, and he had a much lighter touch insofar as his politics, it seems to me, than Bertolucci. And because of it, I think that Milos Forman's work was more successful, quite frankly. Not successful in a commercial sense, but successful as works. I don't know, but let's get into it like point by point.
So let me get my take on this politics here. The thing that I, when revisiting these movies, that I always keep in mind is I don't want my differences of politics to interfere with my judgment of his films as such. I think the fact that his attitudes are different than mine is partly what, in theory, makes it more interesting. It's like, okay, you're a Marxist, or at least you believe you are. I want to see your take on it, and let's kind of work it out on there. I think, part of Bertolucci's baggage is he had success at a very, very young age. He already had in Italy enough of a following with a number of smaller movies that are politically minded. Like Before the Revolution, I think, is one. The Spider Stratagem. They're same bugaboos that you will see in his later career: politics, sex, whatnot, on display. But he gets a following there, and he, in 1970 or somewhere around then, before he's even 30, The Conformist comes out. It's a very lush film, well choiced use of music, very excellent cinematography, an interesting enough story, which, by the way, isn't even his own. It's based on an Umberto Moravia
Mm.
novel, who is a very well known Italian author at the time. And what you do get a sense, though, is his take on fascism and his politics throughout much of his movies, because he comes back to it at least three instances that I'm aware of in his films that I've watched. The Conformist, 1900 or Novecento, and The Last Emperor all have fascism as a key piece of the film. But he's an outsider. He's the enemy of fascism, being if he's a kind of Marxist agitator. And so he has that kind of outside in look on it, but it's still an obsession. And I could tell he doesn't really know what makes up the dynamics of fascism.
No.
But needless to say, most socialists don't. So that it's interesting to see how he portrays it. What interests me more than anything else is it's less about when he gets into politics. It's more about when he gets into human interactions. I think often when he lets his politics speak for him, he becomes less focused on the human. And when he's more focused on the human, the politics become kind of irrelevant. And I think those are the interesting pieces that work in The Conformist, certainly are the most interesting pieces of Novecento. And the film that really doesn't have any substantial politics in it whatsoever, The Last Tango in Paris, might be his best film objective.
I would think so. It's okay. So the thing about Bertolucci, right? What he does is that there's this endless feeling that you're slightly submerged in a dream. Because for those of you who've never watched Bertolucci's pictures, what happens with them is that a lot of times people act and behave in ways, even within a scene, in a way that is not congruent with their past behavior. It's almost as if they're breaking character. A lot of times elements appear on screen that are sort of like dreamlike. So there's this slightly, ever so slightly fantastical edge. And at first, it takes you a while to figure out, well, am I watching an Ed Wood picture or what? And you realize after a while that this is a deliberate choice, and it's interesting what he's doing, because sometimes he can throw you off. He can throw you off and sort of like, reset the clock even within a scene, because of the way that the actors, the characters rather, treat one another and comport themselves, or how certain things emerge. Time itself in his pictures is not perfectly linear. That's more obvious in The Conformist, but you see it also in his other pictures, that sometimes you get little bits of pieces. I mean, look, it's French New Wave. Clearly, he was influenced by the French New Wave, and and he was clearly reacting against the Italian neorealist movement, because what he's portraying is just ever so slightly surreal, like a Borges story. Like it's not quite real, and yet that irreality can speak of something very true and profound about the human experience. So it's not. I'm not knocking the technique. Okay, and it's very much his technique. Yeah.
Fractured is the word that comes to mind.
Yeah.
And I mean that not just in the techniques of filming, because he in many instances he uses flashback a lot in his structure, and kind of back and forth timing. You'll see that a lot, but also in the characters. In most of the films that I think we're going to talk through today, the lead character is traumatized in a significant way. So in The Conformist, the main character we deal with is I guess, a spy or an agent for the fascist government in Italy. He's largely broken because as a young boy, he was abused by basically a chauffeur driver, a gay man who just took advantage of him as a kid. And he didn't know how to deal with that. And thus he's trying that's why the title The Conformist comes in. He becomes a fascist so that he can blend in and be no different from anyone else.
Well,
that's his mentality. But hold on,
right.
I'm not done. That's a fractured character. Marlon Brando, Last Tango in Paris. It's a man in post-traumatic stress. His wife has just violently killed herself, and everything you see him do is in that broken kind of state. The Emperor in The Last Emperor, Puyi, also broken. 3 years old, ripped from his family, forced to basically be a prisoner in the Forbidden City, told he's the Lord of 10,000 years, the ruler of a third of the population of Earth, and yet has absolutely no control over anything that's going on, is used as a tool throughout his entire existence. Important people in his family are either stolen from him, murdered, or tortured in psychological and physical ways. These are it's happened so often you have to accept that it's a main theme
Yeah.
in him for whatever reason.
Hmm.
And that fracturedness in the character makes its way into the film, which accentuates what you have said is basically kind of like a surrealism, or at least certainly not like a kind of stone-faced realist kind of thing, which is interesting from coming from, like I said, a devout Marxist. You'd think he'd be very big in neorealism because that was the Marxist jerk-off session in some
Yeah,
regards.
yeah, it's socialist realism and all that shit. Yeah, yeah. I mean, somebody like who was a good kitchen sink kind of filmmaker,
Well,
Mike
well,
Lee, early Mike
or
Lee would have been
Ken Loach is
Ken
in my
Loach.
mind the
Yeah,
ultimate, and in Italy it would have been your De Sicas and
yeah,
a whole bunch of guys like the Bicycle Thieves. Just that
yeah,
movie is basically the socialist wet dream.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, how could I put this? I I was just extremely disappointed. And by the way, I don't think it's so much that let's start with The Conformist, which I watched in its entirety again. Like I said, I hadn't watched it since I was 19. That's how far I watched it in 1987, and watching it now, Jesus Christ. Well, let's talk with that. The thing that I thought was not that he was that the main character, the Dottore Ciclio, or whatever his name was. I don't think that he was traumatized so much by the sexual abuse as by the fact that he had murdered the chauffeur. Because that's the thing, that in the scene of the rape of the boy, or whatever you want to call it, the sexual encounter of the boy, what have you, he winds up taking a gun and using it to kill the chauffeur, and he flees from the scene of the crime. And my thinking had always been that it was the murder, not so much the sexual abuse, that was weighing on him. And the thing that I saw, I hadn't remembered when I saw it back in '87, but rewatching it, I saw the scene of him confessing, and he confessed to the murder. And I always thought, I mean, I think now that it was the murder that was weighing the guy.
I disagree with that. I mean, if he was really guilty, or if he really thought that the murder was the problem, he would not have felt the need to conform as he did, because the fascist government asked him to kill people. I mean, that was part of the nature. In fact, he could always say, like, look, this man was abusive, and I put under, this element that should have been part of society. I don't think that was the bothering part. The bothering part is that this happened, and he didn't know how to necessarily respond to it. And the fact that he was unsure of it meant that that was what he was guilty over. And that's what he needs to hide in order to say, I'm like everyone else. I'm okay. Nothing to worry about here. And I think that kind of explains his modus operandi more so than the murder. I frankly think that there was nothing he would have been afraid about, or he should have been afraid about, with the murder. But I think if you reflect on what the society was that he's living in the 30s and 40s, he would have something to be afraid about if he did not know how to respond to an adult male taking advantage of him in that way.
Well, be that as it may, the common theme that you said, that they're all traumatized. Yes, they're all traumatized, and the other thing too is that they are all incredibly indecisive. They can't make up their minds what they're going to do. They keep dithering, and at first it seems that they're very resolute, but as the story progresses, you start to realize how they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. They are indecisive men. And it's quite noticeable in like the character of the conformist, who starts the movie that he's going to go and kill this guy, this target, because he's an assassin. But as things emerge, he starts to dither, and this and that and the other. He can't make up his mind. He flees from his handler and all the rest of it. He's dithering. And the character of Paul, played by Marlon Brando in Last Tango in Paris, again, he's a ditherer, because at first he seems very decisive. we're gonna be in this room, and we're not going to the rest of the world is not going to exist. We're just gonna have no names, and we're just gonna fuck here. And then he starts to open up to her, to the girl played by Maria Schneider. And he starts to open up to her, and then she wants to have a relationship with her. He can't make up his mind. What's it going to be? Is it going to be like just anonymous sex in this apartment, or is it going to be like a relationship? Is he going to like wither away in his unhappiness over the death of his wife, or is he going to strive for life again? He can't make up his mind. Can't recall what happens in The Last Emperor.
The Last Emperor it's slightly different because the Emperor cannot make a decision. I mean, I don't mean that in the sense that he's uncertain. I mean, he's not allowed.
Yeah.
And that's the point. Anytime he tries to be decisive, people with actual power deny him that.
Right. Look, I was just disappointed. We could talk about the Conformist in some detail, but I was severely disappointed, and this has happened to me over the years. That I read some work, watch some movie, and then as the years pass, I rewatch it, and I think that, Jesus Christ, this is stupid. I find myself a little bit embarrassed by having thought so highly of something back in the day, and realize that it was a product of my ignorance. And also, I hate to admit this, but there's that element of, everybody else says he's good, so he must be good, and I must be too stupid to realize it. And there's a huge element of that. Because I look at the Conformist, and I think it's, for instance, the obvious thing, he doesn't know what fascism is. He thinks at best it's sort of like aesthetic style. That's what fascism is. He doesn't know what fascism entails. What is it? He cannot give a definition of it. It's a label. That's all it is. It's a label of enemy. That's it. It's remarkable.
Well, yes, he does, but I also think that it's also he's probably thinking more than that. It's not uncommon, or it's not an accident that in the Conformist, the sexual trauma of the main character is tied to him wanting to be a fascist. I think in Bertolucci's mind, he's trying to make a point about that. That in his mind, the fascists are, and he even says it in the Conformist. He says, some people come to fascism for money. Some people use it as an excuse to let some vices out of their system. Very few people come for true dedication to National Socialism or fascism as an ideology. And they say, so why are you here? And this is he won't immediately say what it is until you come to the conclusion of the film. I think Bertolucci is convinced that there's some sort of psychological sexual problem there. I don't think that's fundamentally true, and I think he gets a little bit better as time goes on through his other films. 1900 is certainly, in some regards, in many regards, a hot mess, but he's starting to get a little bit more closer to what fascism is. Still not perfectly. Donald Sutherland actually plays a very interesting character in there, who's, for those of you who don't know, 1900 is a parallel story between a peasant child and man and a aristocratic child and man born on the same day, 1901. It goes through their lives up until I think they're 80 in the film proper. And their parallel life story takes place on a farm. At one point, the farm's foreman, the position is taken over by Donald Sutherland's character, who's with a name like Attila, which gives you some sense of the attitude
not a
he has
light
towards
touch.
fascism. It's not. So there's really not much subtlety in 1900. But I will give it this: it finally makes the connection that the fascist actually has more connection to the socialist peasants than the aristocrats. He's like, I know how you really are, and we know how to run things. He's more an anti-communist than necessarily an anti-socialist. And the truth of the matter is that is more or less how the fascists in Italy were. They were ex-socialists. Mussolini was a socialist before he was the head of the fascists. He gets a little bit sharper on it, but it still, portrays the fascist as a man who is primarily motivated by violent impulses. There's a famous scene where Donald Sutherland is trying to prove to his fellow fascist colleagues what you have to do to a communist by using a cat to represent communist infiltration into a litter of other cats. He says the only thing you have to do is smash it. And he literally like rams into it with his head. So yeah, there you go. Not much subtlety, but it's still a more interesting, compelling take than some of the fascists you're going to get in The Conformist.
Well,
And I
what?
think he's trying to tell this story, this left versus right fight, a number of times. He only kind of gets it. He kind of gets it right by the end of the Last Emperor, which is more about, look, let's not kid ourselves. This great man notion of, you're going to lead, you're a position to lead as an individual society. It's a joke. The emperor of all China, it can't do a fucking thing. And I think Bertolucci, in his representation of that, gets fascism a little bit better, gets the limitations of individuality a lot clearer, and tries to also realize, look, there's a lot of bullshit in the socialists as well. Let's not kid ourselves. And tries to make a sense of what sense of peace an individual man can achieve in this world. It's more compelling at there, but it's like he took 3 at bats to get there.
I don't know. I mean, like watching The Conformist again and understanding the reality of career prospects and career growth as a film director, especially, I recognize that he was sort of like playing to the socialist peanut gallery with The Conformist, and it's just I realize why everybody thought that he was the knees bees. Do keep in mind, I came across Bertolucci right when The Last Emperor came out, right? And so that was why I started paying attention. I didn't know who the hell this guy was, because I was ignorant. And so I watched his movies. I thought, oh, he's great, and everybody says he's great. And now I realize that they were saying he's great because of his politics, because he seemed to be hitting, especially with The Conformist, he seemed to be hitting the right notes. I'm assuming with his previous work, with the work that made it big in Italy, it was more or less the same thing. He was hitting it big, and with a home crowd, and The Conformist was like a step up, an international co-production, and he does the film that every leftist would want to do, and the fascist man bad, but no coherent idea of what even is fascism, because he does not know, apart from like having statues of eagles and busts of heads moving around. He does not know what fascism entails. He has no idea. For him, it's a political label. And that's why I found The Conformist, I found it deeply distasteful. And that's why my approach to Novecento, as I started watching it, I found it very, very difficult. And ultimately, I was like, okay, fuck it. Life is too short. Because there was that notion that he was just... what's that thing that leftists hate of labeling people, right? They hate it when you label them. You just call them a label. Well, he's labeling fascists. He's labeling right-wingers. He's labeling everybody who's center-left to the right as evil and or at best traumatized automatons to their PTSD or whatever the hell. And he doesn't grant them, how can I put it? He doesn't grant them motivation as to why they believe in what they believe. He just, and especially that movie. And because everybody who ever talks about Bernardo Bertolucci, they talk about The Conformist. Now, insofar as Storaro is concerned, I want to cleave Storaro right off the bat from Bertolucci, because the cinematography is extraordinary. The shots are amazing, compositionally, in movement. There are a few shots here and there that I thought were kind of silly, that I hadn't noticed back in the day because I didn't know any better. But like the Dutch tilt a couple of times, and like like one zoom in like a slightly surreal sequence. It's sort of like just a little bit cringy, right? But overall, the cinematographer is extraordinary. How could I put
So
it?
a few responses. Hold on, few
Sure.
responses, because you made a couple of statements there. One, when you say he's playing to the socialist peanut gallery, that suggests a cynicism which I don't think is really at play in his films. I think they're pretty sincere, even if the politics are slight.
No.
More importantly, I think you're over emphasizing the conformist. Yeah, I know a lot of people like it. Very few people I know who like Bertolucci just rest everything on the conformist.
No, yeah, I know.
And I think more importantly, like I said, it's unfortunate that you came to 1900 or Novecento under the impression like this is conformist part two. In part because I think there's a chance that you might have missed, I think, something more interesting going on in 1900, which is it's a pastoral story. It certainly tries to have metaphors about grand things going on in the 20th century, but by and large, it functions as it's the land, how owners and workers tend to the land and the farm, and it's very seasonal. There's a style of life in the summer, a style of life in the fall, winter, and spring. And what he has there, and this is why I don't think he's just necessarily playing to the socialist peanut gallery, he's actually doing something which I have seen very common amongst Italian left-wingers, which is they betray their sympathy, interest, and dedication to a more aristocratic point of view. There are a lot of Italian socialists who are aristocrats, and when you dig under their socialism, they really just want the aristocratic lifestyle or the world order back. Visconti, he's a card-carrying Marxist, but if you look at all of his films, the other film which 1900 is in dialogue with, The Leopard, is a similar idea that basically there was something of a more idyllic time when the aristocrats and the workers kind of were in a healthy tension with each other compared to the rise of the bourgeoisie and the kind of fascist manifestation after that. He still has that ideal, and he's trying to reconcile the aristocratic De Niro character with the peasant Gerard Depardieu character. And I think it gets more interesting than that, than to just say, oh, here's the socialist wonderful story I want to give. Certainly more sympathetic to the socialists in that film than the fascists, not without question. But it's more interesting and complicated than that. And I think the best part of that movie, which by and large is in some regards a hot mess, a 5.5-hour movie tends to be. It's just one of those things. But the first hour and a half, when you have the old padrone, the landlord, played by Burt Lancaster, and his foreman, played by Sterling Hayden, who, by the way, was a radical socialist in his life. That's the most compelling part of the story. When you have that, this is what the order of life under the farmland would have been, and it kind of everything that cycles away, regardless of where the politics come from, is a deterioration from that ideal, which Bertolucci is trying to get to, and I respect that. I think it's more compelling than the conformist, without question. And it's unfortunate that the conformist polluted your reading of that.
Well, there's something that you hit on that I hate to say it, but that I have to. You articulated something that is underlying my thinking about Bertolucci, my reappraisal of Bertolucci, and that I find him a cynical filmmaker. That's my disappointment in the guy. I as a man, as a grown man, I read him as being a cynical operator, and that's why I don't think that highly of him. I was. See, I don't come at this like happily, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna shit all over some guy. I mean, like my goal insofar as rewatching some film is to re-experience the happiness I felt at the time that I was watching the picture back in the day. I want to hero worship. I don't have a problem saying that. I want to find some filmmaker that I admire enormously. I mean, you have no idea how much I admire Coppola and his apogee period. Between Godfather 1 and Apocalypse Now. And there are a few films after that in the beautiful decay that followed, One Through the Heart, that I like still enjoy and think that they're wonderful, and I see what he's doing and all the rest of it. But see, when I rewatched Apocalypse Now, it was better than I remembered it. I mean, that's the thing. And so I'm like, I'm down. I wanted to be amazed by Bertolucci. I wanted to be amazed by an artist. I'm not looking to be disappointed by an artist. And yet I have to say that you articulated what was my underlying sense of the man, is that he was cynical. He was cynical, and he was a limo liberal, as they're called, right? A champagne socialist. He was somebody who believed in his socialism, a sort of like a social badge, and perhaps even a necessary badge. And I suspect that he was smart enough to realize how full of shit the socialists really were, but decided coldly and in a calculated manner that he had to portray the fascists as bad fascists. I'm not saying that the fascists are good, but you can't just say that some team is bad just because. You have to give a reason for it, there's no reason here.
Well, I think you may have misread me a bit. I don't think he was cynical. I think he was probably naive, but I don't think cynical.
Oh, no.
Because
I think
because
it was
I think
cynical.
I mean no, I mean I just tend to disagree with that. I mean there's nothing in his career that says to me cash grab. There's nothing in
The
there that
Last
really
Emperor?
says
The Last Emperor?
The Last Emperor is not a cash grab.
Oh, come
It did
on.
not make money.
It made money for him.
Not nearly at the level that you'd think that a true cash grab would. No, other films would have been more of a cash grab than that. No, I think it's sincere. I do think, however, he was naive in his not just his understanding of fascism, but perhaps even his understanding of socialism. I think he had some sense of like an idyllic attitude about what it could mean. I think as he grew older, he came to realize, and it comes out more and more in his films, that there is a weakness in the socialist actuality. And I think The Last Emperor even flat out shows it. The Last Emperor flat out shows what cruelty happened during the Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he shows what it does to honest socialists who try in all sincerity to take the emperor and say, look, we sincerely believe men are born good, and regardless of what crimes you've committed, we're going to make you an honest citizen, and we're not going to go out of our way to harm you. We're going to try to improve you. Say what you will about whether that's a legitimate idea or not. He understands the tensions between that ideal form of socialism and the reality of what comes out of it. I think he was naive to think that there was going to be some sort of synthesis coming out of that. I mean, 1900 is a whole film about naivete in a certain regard. I think when you see him interviewed on it, he sincerely thought at the time that in all the metaphors floating around that movie, that Gerard Depardieu would represent the left-wing element of Western society, De Niro representing not just a right wing, but more of like an American form of right wingism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just quoting Bertolucci, and he thought that this was a film that was going to bring people together. I don't think that was just a pure cynical move. I just think that's the thinking of a young kid who doesn't really know that the films don't really work that way. But I can still admire the sincerity in trying to pull it off. I don't think 1900 is a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination. But there's enough interesting things in it to merit the case of watching it. And I do think his films get better as he progresses. I will give the exception to, I think The Last Tango in Paris might still be his best film. But you can't kind of, in some sense, disassociate The Last Tango in Paris from the gears that are going on in this guy's brain. Yes, the politics aren't really overtly there, but it's still Bertolucci's kind of take on psychosexuality.
Yeah, I think that moving on to Last Tango in Paris, I rewatched not all of it, just clips of it, because I saw it. I must have been like 25 when I saw it the last time in full, and over the years, of course, you've seen different little shots here and there, and in preparation for this podcast, I sort of like hopscotch through it. I was again impressed by the cinematography, especially the exteriors. I really liked the exterior shots. I found what impressed me. I remember when I watched it at 25, and when I watched it now, briefly as I said, was the magnetic performance of Marlon Brando. That was a thing that I was astonished by, and it really is a bravura performance. That was his year, 72, of being able to do both The Godfather, such a mannered, structured performance, and Last Tango in Paris, which is completely random. No, not completely random. Rather, it feels
Improv.
spontaneous and improv. And there are sections that are clearly improv that work very well. It's really interesting because Coppola did two pictures with Marlon Brando, right? The Godfather one and Apocalypse Now, and it's very clear that in The Godfather one, Coppola had the reins, and in Apocalypse, he wanted to capture that spontaneity that he had seen in Last Tango in Paris, but failed. He failed to capture because there are a few scenes. I mean, think about it. Apocalypse Now was, the same cinematographer, the same approach to doing improvised dialogue, and trying to get something out of it, which worked beautifully in Last Tango in Paris, but was sort of like a mess in the end of Apocalypse Now, because Apocalypse Now deserved a stronger ending. And I think that nobody really disputes that the ending is flabby as all get out. But anyway, it worked really well in Last Tango in Paris. And I ascribe it to Marlon Brando's performance, the strength of it. And he's totally dominating the movie. It seemed, how could I put it? It seemed almost as if Bertolucci was along for the ride, you know? And you know how I noticed it? The thing that struck me the most is that, see, Bertolucci had this habit of dubbing all his sounds, right? But he didn't.
Hold on. That's an Italian thing.
Yeah,
The Italians don't record sound live on set. Sorry, that's an important thing to note. Continue.
yeah. Actually, they do. They have they do record. They just don't.
Now they
No,
do,
no,
but
no, no,
not at
no.
the time.
At the time, they did. They needed that for the guide track to do the dubbing later on. I know this. It's not something that I know this for a fact. That they always record sound. It's that they don't record it in a way that could be used later for the answer print. Okay.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you'd be going against everything I heard about people always talking on set. It's not, it's not a useful audio by any means. No one's
No, no, no. It's
quiet.
it's not supposed to be it's a guide track. You need it in order to do looping later. If you don't have that guide track, you cannot do looping later. Okay, it's necessary. Okay, and a take where there is no sound because the sound guy blew it. That's a useless take because you can't even loop it later on. Okay, or it's exceedingly difficult to loop it. Believe me, I know this. It's not something that I'm just pulling out of my ass. It's something of the craft of filmmaking. Okay. So anyway, yeah, they do have it, but in Last Tango in Paris, there are long sections of it where they don't do the dubbing, they don't do looping of the dialogue. It's the on-set dialogue that was spoken by the characters, and it makes it very that juxtaposition where some of it is dubbed and some of it is very real, and also the fact that, for instance, her boyfriend is dubbed. Whereas Paul, the Marlon Brando character, he's got the actual audio. That created an interesting effect for me. The effect of immediacy on the one hand, and sort of like inauthenticity on the other. Because I think that we can all agree that the boyfriend, Maria Schneider's character's boyfriend, the nameless girl, he's a filmmaker or aspiring film director. And he's just a plastic little nothing, right? The complete opposite of Paul. And I thought that was a neat juxtaposition of the use of sound. I was impressed by that.
It is, but a couple of things. One, it is interesting that that character is a nothing, considering who plays him. That's Jean Perliot, the boy from the 400 Blows, one of the most famous French young actors at the time. It's not like he was an uncharismatic guy. That was an artistic choice by the director to do that. And also, to the extent to which you feel Brando dominates the film, it's impossible to get Brando to legitimately work unless the director's, coaxing him into an environment where he's going to do that. So to say, Brando did this and Bertolucci was taken for a ride, I think that's immensely unfair to the reality of, look, Bertolucci put Brando in a position where he was able to do this, and
Okay, fair enough.
undoubtedly Brando, it's his movie. There's no question about that. But Bertolucci put the necessary conditions to make that happen.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, because like Altman always said that good direction is just putting the camera in the right spot and then getting out of the way of the actors. And so yeah, that sometimes that you're right. You're absolutely right. You're as a director, you're creating the conditions whereby the actors and the camera can and the location can interact in an effective way. So yeah, I'll take that back. But what I will say is that um, I have to admit that it's stuck in my craw the conformist the cynicism of the conformist. I really did. I think also insofar as Last Tango in Paris, I did find it an exploitative picture. I'm not one to say that lightly. I'm not one of these like like little snowflake guys and like, oh my god, like poor Maria Schneider got anally raped with butter. And no, it was an intoxicating sequence actually. But there are other sequences where, like for instance, she's topless for long stretches of dialogue between the two. That was sort of like, you know what I was thinking to myself? I was thinking, isn't she cold? I thought it was a little bit exploitative. I thought that uh, there was an element of prurience to some of the Last Tango that was sort of like, again, sort of like to draw attention to us. It felt cynical. It felt, we call it on YouTube clickbaity, that you're doing something for the clicks, right? Yeah, it felt a lot of times that there was elements of it that were clickbaity, and I was looking beyond those elements of clickbaitiness to the picture, and I realized that a lot of people who take the Last Tango in Paris seriously are all kind of like tacitly and silently acknowledging, yeah, there's a lot of clickbaity shit, but we'll just look over it and try to see the picture as it's being presented, right? There's a lot to this is the thing. See, if the guy was an incompetent Bertolucci, I wouldn't be ragging on him. I'd be like, oh well, it's the best he could do. If we were talking about Ed Wood, who was a filmmaker, I think we can all agree with a very, very limited ability, we'd all be like, oh, that's the best he could do. But see, the fact that is that Bertolucci was a very, very talented man, and that's why his cynicism, which is I'm realizing as we're talking, is the thing that really strikes me the most, is so unpalatable to me.
Well, I guess we're just in different mindsets because I just really don't see. I mean, I'm not, pulling your leg here. I don't see any cynicism whatsoever. And as to your notions of the clickbaitiness, I mean, my response is, I take him at face value. I mean, this is a man who grew up in a farmland community and amongst a stock of people who are just more frank about sex, more frank about I mean, when you see cows and your pigs fucking openly in the field, you just don't care about that prudery after a certain point. And I just don't really see that film or any of his films really as clickbaity in that regard. I just think that's frankly, his innocence in there. I don't really think that's exploitative in the way you think it is. And as to the question of like, oh, is Maria Schreider, isn't she cold for bearing her tits for so long? But like, well, remember, like for number one, women of the generation of the 60s and 70s, but also a French woman of that time, it would be a shock to me if she was fully clothed throughout the whole movie, to be perfectly honest. I mean, so I just don't really bear that in mind. I mean, and I know later in her life she objected to the fact that they, it's in the film, so I'm not shocking you, by this, when they stick some butter up her ass in the film, she's like, I felt, raped and violated by that. I'm sure she, in retrospect, felt that way. She didn't ever mention it until much later.
Yeah.
I think the reality of the situation, you can call me a cold, heartless, indifferent, evil person. Frankly, the film outlasts her.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. And also, I heard back in the day that she had offered Marlon Brando to have actual sex during the making of the movie, and he turned her down because he wanted to be able to focus on the performance. So, oh, fuck off. I don't buy this Janie come lately Me Too bullshit. Okay, I mean, fuck that. I don't buy it. But it's at, see, I look at him and I see that he did like, The Conformist is like, for the peanut gallery of the left, especially the critical class, and they'll love him. The Last Tango in Paris is all like sexy and hot, but like trying to have like deep thoughts about sex and shit like that. And then The Last Emperor is what is The Last Emperor? It's basically the Driving Miss Daisy of China kind of thing. It's clickbaity.
No. That is the most cynical read of that I've ever heard. No, The Last Emperor, I would say, is similar in some regard to Forrest Gump in the notion of what is the individual's place in the playing of history, and the actual truth of the matter is either not much or not in the way you think it would be. I think there's much more to The Last Emperor than you're giving it credit.
Well,
and I don't think it's just like that lousy, it's just the Oscar bait film. No, it far exceeds what the Oscar has given us for all of these years.
Well, look, the fact of the matter is, I know that picture was only filmed because the Chinese Communist Party allowed him to. It was the first picture that had been filmed in the Forbidden City. And yeah, sure. So somebody with the right lefty credentials and a guy who's willing to play ball. That's the thing. I know that this guy played ball, and we will never know what kind of compromises he had to make in order to appease the Communist Party. But yeah, I mean, I just
it was, but all the same, it was still fairly daring to really stick his nose up at Mao in that film. More importantly, I mean, you got to let me finish here.
Yeah,
the actor cast as the warden
mm-hmm.
was a legitimate survivor of the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah,
he was the deputy. He was the deputy minister of culture. He was actually raised. His family were notable Chinese Catholics.
Yeah,
as like, I mean, this is not some like, oh, China's such a lovely place. The communists don't get off very well.
No. Mao didn't come off very well. Yeah. You got to understand the political moment, too. This was at the time where the Gang of Five were being publicly tried for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution that had happened either this very year or slightly before. I forget the dates of it. See, this was at the time where Deng Xiaoping was deliberately scrubbing Mao and turning China towards the West, towards capitalism. Okay,
not entirely. What he said was, and it's actually important because this is the throwaway line he gave that the Chinese government to this day maintains. Mao was 80% right, 20% wrong.
Yeah, okay,
and that's the official rule that they have taken. And this film, Mao is not 80% right in this film.
Okay, well, my thinking is that it reads to me as kind of like a state-sponsored propaganda. I'm not saying this with happiness. Okay, I'm not putting the guy down. It's like gleefully. On the contrary, but I have to say that in my own life experience and looking at this guy's career, I realized that he was cynical. He did a lot of things cynically, out of cynical motives, in order to please people, so that he would get the prestige and get invited to the right cocktail parties. I see his body of work as a very clear map of that kind of meretricious attitude towards his art, and I don't care for it, to tell you the truth.
And I am respectfully disagreeing with you, and I am respectfully giving instances of why I think that's wrong. I mean, just saying, well, I disagree. Well, I mean, fair enough.
I'm giving you reasons. I'm giving you reasons why I think so.
And I am giving you counter reasons why I don't think so. So, there we are. I mean, it's just the difference of opinion.
Yeah, at the very okay. Let me put it this way: we will not come to a definition as to whether you're right or I'm right, or which of us is wrong. But I can point to things that buttress my argument insofar as the cynicism of what he did in those three particular pictures. Insofar as The Conformist, Last Tango in Paris, and Last Emperor. I can give very strong reasons. I mean, you agree that for all his talk of like fascist bad and anti-fascism, right? and even he has some character sing the Internationale for crying out loud, you recognize that he had not the foggiest clue what fascism actually was. I mean, you agree with Matt insofar as
Yeah,
a
but
conformist.
that doesn't get you to point Z, which is what you want to say. He's cynical. No, I say that makes him naive. That makes him you could even say it makes him ignorant. That doesn't make him cynical. That's a logical step you haven't made yet.
Okay, from the inference I am making from the available evidence is that you look at it once insofar as a conformist. You can say, okay, he was naive. And then you look at his deliberate exploitativeness of Marie Schneider and sexing her up. I mean, he basically has her looking like a little bit of a prostitute in most of the picture, especially at the beginning section, right? It seems that he's just selling sex, clickbaity for sex. That's my reading. Okay, for that second picture, and for The Last Emperor, it would seem that he was just currying favor with the communist government and trying to get an Oscar Beatty picture, which he did get. He got a bunch of Oscars for it. Okay, and so from my perspective, from my read, the inference that I draw from the available evidence is that this guy was a cynical filmmaker, and I don't.
And my counter,
Yeah, and
my counter
and
to that
also hang on. There's also the obvious issue that he couldn't edit worth a damn. His editing is shit. It doesn't flow. He does not know how to edit, or he doesn't know how to run an editorial department to cut a picture in a way that's fluent. You got to admit that. There are lots.
No, I don't have to admit that. I really don't, and I don't see it. I certainly don't see it in The Last Emperor. I don't see it in the case.
Like I said, I haven't seen the Last Emperor.
I don't see it in the case of I don't see it in the case of Last Tango in Paris. To your point of, is he cynically exploiting sex in Last Tango? Well, his subject is sex, so I fail to see how he could not show titillating sex. I'm sorry, but I just, call me biased. That's just not the same thing as just being exploitative. It's not a pornographic film in that regard.
Well, like, for instance,
a lot of the sex in that film is very uncomfortable.
Well, you can say the following. Like, for instance, you can certainly show sex. I mean, excuse me, you can certainly have a sequence or a movie about sex without showing sex. And the obvious example is the chess match in Thomas Crown. That's a classic example. You can have a scene or a sequence or a whole movie, if you want, that is not exploitative and is saturated in sex. The Last Tango in Paris.
Well, of course you can make things sexy without depicting sex, but why does that then therefore conclude that you cannot depict sex in and of itself? Because that's just icky and wrong and pornographic.
No, I'm not saying that.
Doesn't flow from
I'm
that.
not saying that. I'm saying that
You're implying it. You're heavily implying it.
I'm not. Okay, well, I'm saying explicitly. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that his use of nudity in The Last Tango seemed to me exploitative. What do you want me to say?
It doesn't seem that case to me. I mean, and that's the point of this conversation, to argue why we think differently. I think that's a man in that film who's using sex to portray the psychological scarring position that both of those characters are in. The sex is not necessarily the battlefield, but it's certainly the map upon which their mental landscapes have been drawn.
Well, no, my thinking insofar as the character of Maria Schneider played, what was her name, or did she have a name? Just girl? Okay. So my sense is that she's not traumatized. My sense is that she is just on a little escapade, and once it gets real, then she wants nothing to do with Paul. Once it's fun when it is anonymous, when it's anonymous sex. But once she actually starts to find out who he actually is, that he's an owner of a flop house, then she wants nothing to do with him because she's a nice bourgeois girl, and she wants to have a nice bourgeois existence. And these bourgeois escapades, they're fun for a bit, but when the shit gets heavy, she wants nothing to do with him. I actually forgot, she shot him right at the end.
She does shoot him, but she is someone who in theory wants something more real in her life, but
in reality, she doesn't.
Upon confronting an actually wounded man, she pokes at a bear that she's not prepared for. And then when she gets a man who is in a position where he really wants something out of her, she's, drawn, taught. In fact, let's not kid ourselves. He kind of put her in an extreme position to where she didn't necessarily want to go. she wanted a straight out relationship, but he frankly tortured her to the point where she didn't want to be with him anymore. But when he came to his mind that maybe she does have something I want, it's past the prime. She can't do anything about it other than to literally shoot him. It's an interesting narrative at play there. I don't think it's cynical. I mean,
No, no,
I
no.
really think that,
I read it differently. I read it that she was excited by the anonymity of it, and at first, at the very very first of it, sure, she wanted to know more about it, but then she became intoxicated by this netherworld that they were living in the apartment, and then once he started to actually start to reveal himself, and there was the possibility of a real relationship, that's when she rejected him.
I think she rejected him when he forced his pain upon her.
Well,
And he
we could be
forced
saying the same thing in two different ways.
saying the same thing in two different but importantly different ways. Like I think he took his trauma and forced it upon her, and that's what she negatively responded to. Not necessarily his rawness, right? No, there was cruelty done to her. I think that in the narrative of that story, that is what happened to her.
Well, my thinking is more that it was sort of like a hurt so good kind of vibe to it, and that even the sexually painful episodes that they participated in was something that turned her on, even when she rejected it in the moment, but it turned her on a visceral level. But when he started telling her what was going on with his life, when he started breaking the rules that he himself had imposed, that's when she rejected him.
I think she was already kind of exhausted with him at that point. Because if you're talking about, hey, it's me again, when they go to the little tango
Hmm.
place, she's already rejected him by that point. In fact, you could tell on her face that she's exhausted at
Mm.
that point. I think he exhausted her. The reality of it, the pain in his being, was just too much for her. You could say whether it was good, bad, or indifferent on her part to respond that way, but I think that's kind of the nature of what happened.
Well, of the pictures of Bertolucci, I would agree with you that it's probably the best picture, precisely because it is so divorced from politics. And one of the things I find so incredibly amusing about Bertolucci is his abhorrence to being bourgeois. I don't understand that at all. I mean, it's
Well, I
a
don't
European thing.
know. Well, it may be, but I mean, like you do get a kind of celebration of it in The Last Emperor. The emperor at his best in that film is when you have two men, two father figures, one played by Peter O'Toole, his English tutor,
Hmm.
and then one the warden, basically just trade him how to be like a normal human being, and like he's definitely very bourgeois in Peter O'Toole's character. He says, train you how to be a gentleman. A gentleman, should mean what he says and say what he means. And he, teaches him to play tennis and all of these other things that dress, how to dress properly, engage in social customs. And even his warden, who, yes, in theory is a socialist, but he's telling him like, here's how you tie your shoes. Here's how you piss in the bucket at night without waking everybody up because you've been peeing in the middle of the bucket, creating a big ringing sound, and everybody's annoyed. Pee on the side of the bucket so that you don't wake people up. Don't claim responsibility for these crimes that you didn't commit. You could not possibly have been responsible for, the biological warfare experiments that was done against the Chinese. So don't claim that you actually did. It's basically just simple. That is simple, basic morality, and even in many cases, basic middle class morality. So he's an evolving filmmaker. He's not so easy to pin down.
Well, be that as it may, I was disappointed by him. I was disappointed, and frankly, I thought less of him. Less of him as I started to realize what was going on. It just he just seemed like the. I don't think that he's a filmmaker who will endure. I think that Storaro as a filmmaker will endure much more. I think that his body of work was much more substantial, and his affiliation with Bertolucci is what will drag along Bertolucci's reputation over the years. But I think that people will look back and they'll have like these quote unquote fond memories of the conformist. But especially as probably in the next 50 years, 100 years, the wheel turns insofar as aesthetics and politics are concerned, and people are going to start to see. I think they're going to start to reject that kind of like overt leftism. I mean, the get woke, go broke thing, I think is actually right now we're saturated with this kind of woke art, and I think that the worm is going to turn in that regard. And when it
I
does,
think
people are going to
Bertel-
viscerally reject a lot of people and a lot of the worthy people merely because of their politics. You see what I'm saying? Just as today
well,
people reject Ezra Pound merely because of his politics.
Well, Bertolucci ain't woke in that fashion, and I think one look at The Last Tango in Paris will prove that he ain't woke in their eyes. As to the longevitude of Bertolucci, let me just say I don't see red flags in the way that you might think. I certainly see red flags, but there are different kinds of red flags. I don't see anything in his films that suggests to me that there's no way in hell this guy is going to endure. I think it all remains to be seen. I think there's substantial enough work to make the case that he will stay.
Well, when you look back on the period of Shakespeare, right? And Shakespeare was not alone. There was a whole gaggle of other playwrights writing plays of greater or lesser success. Some of them were very successful. Some of these playwrights were very, very good. But what's happened over the years is that you start to ignore the second tier and just focus on the top tier, and you just focus on the Shakespeares of the period. And so I think that Bertolucci was in the running for a bit, perhaps, but he sort of like sank, and the people who are going to stay afloat are clearly Coppola, of the European filmmakers who are roughly of his age, of Bertolucci's age or generation. I think Milos Forman is going to stick around, is going to be more remembered, especially for not just One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but The People versus Larry Flint, which is a picture that I recently saw again. And I was amazed by the picture, recognizing what an extraordinary achievement it was in so many regards. It just doesn't seem like such a big deal because it seems effortless and easy. But that kind of achievement and that ease of and effortlessness is extremely hard to achieve. And I think that's the thing about Bertolucci. He's like, in the great game, in the great race. I think that he was. I think that he was an also ran. And look, I hate to harp on this issue, but I think that ultimately it was that cynicism that I'm reading into him. That I don't think I'm unique in that feel, that vibe. He was playing people, okay, and trying to get the short term gain, by playing to the various peanut galleries. Or playing nice with certain determining powers in the socio-cultural landscape in order to get acknowledged, in order to up his profile. There's something to him. There isn't that sense of independence of somebody like a Woody Allen who just goes in his direction and, you follow him or you don't, but you know for a fact that he's not playing to any gallery whatsoever. He's just doing his own shit and doesn't give a shit about anybody else except his own vision, which is admirable, which is, I think, what an artist should be doing, pursuing their own agenda. But there's this sense that Bertolucci was sort of like keying into other people's agenda, in order for his own benefit. That's the vibe I get, man. I mean, look, I insist.
Well,
I am not saying this gleefully, okay?
Well, you don't have to repeat yourself. I'll just simply disagree with you. I mean, I understand your position fairly clearly. I mean, you articulated it several times.
Okay, well,
I would just simply say I just don't see the cynicism. I frankly see a man who's fairly honest, but I think that honesty gives way to kind of childish naivete at sometimes. Now, if you're going to ask me, is he in my top pantheon of filmmakers in terms of is he in the top 3? No, probably not. Has he merited his worth in my eyes? Yes, I think he has.
I see the talent, and I think that's what bothers me the most. I see the enormous talent of this guy, and it feels like that the work fell short, and I think that's what bothers me the most. Yeah. And so on that note, I think that we should call it a podcast. This has been the Coach and Benway show. We've been discussing the films of Bernardo Bertolucci. And Dr. Benway, as always, I'd like to leave you with the final word.
Make up your own mind and watch the films yourselves. I think that is the best course of action.
Yes.
And I think it's worth your time.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. So on that note, take care and we will catch you soon.